Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the editor with My Security Media. And I'm just going to run through some initial protocols. This session is being recorded, so we will make this available later on. Naturally, there's some media in the room as well. We're going to very much encourage Q&A. We're going to be holding a panel session, so please don't hesitate to raise your hand, and we'll have some roaming mics. We'll get underway with the panel session first, but I will definitely invite questions from the audience, maybe not from the back there either. We are the Australia in Space magazine. We also produce the Australia in Space TV channel and our Space and Defence news channel as well. So you can subscribe to these and we're producing content weekly with our weekly newsletter as well on our observations of the Australian and international space sector. This particular session follows on a range of events that we've been holding nationally. We're just off the back of two events in Sydney and in Brisbane with the University of New South Wales and the Centre for Advanced Technologies up in Brisbane, and a host of events that we've been doing in Perth, and this is also in the lead up to the Indo-Pacific Space and Earth Conference 23 to 24 October as well, and we'll hear more from that. Thank you to our national sponsors. I won't walk them all through, but we are being supported nationally, and the two there, the educational supporters, One Giant Leap Foundation and the Andy Thomas Space Foundation also. And most importantly for tonight, our venue and host sponsor is the Australian National University Institute of Space and ANU College of Health and Medicine, and without them tonight would not have happened, and it's a great facility as well. So without further ado, please give a warm round of applause for Professor Anna Moore, Vice-Chancellor's Entrepreneurial Professor and Director with the ANU Institute of Space. Round of applause, please.
Thank you very much. So, hi everyone, so welcome all. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here for an evening of vibrant discussion on space health and medicine. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet today, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. InSpace connects ANU space research with society's greatest challenges. We do this by growing our Australian space ecosystem in partnership with industry, government and communities. I'm proud to head an institute which thoroughly embraces multidisciplinarity. To me, being a space doctor, a space medicine expert is just as important as being a space lawyer or a space astronomer. We're kind of down here, I'm an astronomer. Every discipline is important. And that reminds me, a good friend of mine, an Australian who ran the Mount Wilson Observatory, he used to say at events that when he was asked if he had a PhD, and he said, yes, I am a doctor, but I'm not a doctor that helps people. Well, tonight I am delighted to say this is a panel that is going to be inspiring you about space medicine and well-being and can help you as well. Afterwards, we have canapes and drinks downstairs. Our team would love to welcome you there for some hearty chat with our panel members. And at this point, I would like to hand you over to the moderator. I think Chris will be the moderator today. And I wish you best of luck.
So tonight we're going to hear from Professor Tracy Smart AO, Air Vice Marshal retired, Royal Australian Air Force, ANU College of Health and Medicine. Professor Gordon Cable, Clinical Associate Professor, School of Medicine, University of Adelaide. Gordon, thanks for coming over from Adelaide. Associate Professor David Kim, Honorary Lecturer, School of History, College of Arts and Social Sciences with ANU. David, thanks for joining us. And Dr. Ben Bramble, Senior Lecturer, School of Philosophy with ANU also. So please welcome our panel. We thought we'd start off with just introducing each of the panellists and where their interest came in space or for space. And obviously there'll be a bit of history here, potentially, but obviously different perspectives as well. So maybe Gordon, we'll start with yourself. What got you into the space domain?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Well, first of all, I'm very proud to say that this year I've started as a professor of space medicine at ANU, as well as still having an academic affiliation with Adelaide. So that's been a really great development for me. But my interest started as a kid, really. I mean, I think everybody who's interested in aviation and space, that generally starts at an early age. I remember my favourite TV program in the early 70s was Lost in Space. Do you remember that one? They made movies of that more recently. But, my true passion developed, I think, when I graduated medicine. I learned to fly, and that sort of interest in aviation then developed into an understanding that, gee whiz, pilots actually do need medical assistance, medical help, and I pursued a career in aviation or aerospace medicine. And like most space doctors around the world, I've come through the military system too, not as a uniformed doctor, but most military, or a lot of military doctors become space flight surgeons, and I guess I'm in that mould. So I have had a long association with the RAF. It was probably about 10 or 12 years ago I realised that Australia has a lot to contribute in the space medicine field, and I started to explore what we were doing, what we could potentially do, and also was acutely aware with the coming need for humans going to space that medical support would be required and more education would be required in that. So I started to put together some training programs in space medicine for health professionals of various kinds. So that's really where my space journey began. It's kind of snowballed since then. I was very privileged to spend about 15 months working with the Australian Space Agency on secondment, helping them with some space medicine work. So it's been a really fascinating journey into space for me. So that's pretty much it, Chris.
Thank you, Gordon. And Tracy?
Thanks, Chris. Well, I've been a space nut since I was 5 years old. I still remember, I'm old enough to remember, being in Auntie Mary's kitchen, watching the black and white telly and watching Neil Armstrong walk on the moon, which was an amazing moment in my life. And then also remember my dad got out his telescope that night because we wanted to see the men on the moon, obviously unsuccessful. But it really was seared in my memory. In fact, I've still got my scrapbook from when I was 5 years old of the Apollo 11 mission. So, but I was interested in space. I actually visited the Kennedy Space Centre when I was 13 on a family holiday and looked at that and said, this is what I want to be. I want to be an astronaut. Unfortunately, then reality hit that I lived in Australia and I'm an asthmatic and have things which will mean I'm not an astronaut. But I ended up joining the Air Force as a medical officer, and I was able to specialise in aerospace medicine, similar to what Gordon was saying. And, that opened up many opportunities for me, including meeting Neil Armstrong as well, which was obviously the thrill of my life and wins every competition like who's the most famous person you've ever met. Always win that. So, now I'm really pleased that, 55 years later, I'm now kind of working in the space area and being a mission space specialist in space. And my role here in ANU is to really develop the space medicine capability along with colleagues, and particularly look at, creating education and training pathways for those 5-year-old and older kids of today who may really be able to have a career in space in Australia that unfortunately it took me a long time to get to. Thanks.
Wonderful. And Ben, and we'll come back to the aerospace and space medicine that you two hold. And Ben, yourself?
Hi. So I'm a philosopher at ANU, a moral philosopher. I'm interested in many different areas of moral philosophy, including quite sort of abstract theoretical ones like questions in value theory, but more recently, a whole array of applied questions concerning the value of animals, questions concerning the ethics of the pandemic, and most recently space ethics. And I guess philosophers have been interested in space and ethical questions that space raises, I think, probably as soon as they became aware that we could potentially go into space. But really now I think these questions have become kind of a bit more live or relevant, because obviously we're going into space. And so philosophers are really, I think there's a real sort of swell of excitement among international philosophers concerning space. And so I'm interested in many ethical questions raised by space, including should we be space tourists when there's so much suffering on Earth? Should we allow private companies to be going into space at all? And if so, how should we regulate them? Also questions like, questions in aesthetics. So, what are the implications of all these satellites buzzing around for the beauty of the night sky and the contribution that the sky at night makes to human well-being? Anyway, these sort of questions. So I look forward to talking with you guys tonight about
We'll
this.
cover some of those topics as well. And David, yourself.
Hi, thanks, Chris. I'm coming from the history background, how I involved this one. One time, as you know, all the most of people's hero, I also had a chance to study Neil Armstrong, how he became a first man walking on the moons. Before he became the first man astronaut, I found out that he actually involved or attended a Korean War earlier 1950s. During that time, he was traveling from Japan to Korea so many times for the war operation. And after that, he started to involve NASA and the space things around the late 1950 to 60s as a test pilot. And I found out that he was an ordinary man, but he had a passion, and he also had a kind of the spirit of a challenge. And also he had a personal belief in his own visions. That was quite motivational. I'm sure everybody might have a similar stuffs, but whoever want to achieve something, I think Neil Armstrong was one of the guys, especially for the space science. My field is covering broadly, not only from history, but also more space science as well as humanity integrate. So for that, I cover Mars long-term travel, as well as human research, also behavior of the astronaut, how they behave during their travel. And also, of course, I found out some countermeasure of those space travelers. And of course, I also concerned about the personal pet as not an experiment material, but as a human company during the travel times. So those things also relate to the spirituality and meditation, also risk management. So those items will be part of the human research, especially travel to the Mars. So that is kind of the, of course, eventually heading to the colonialization of the Mars is another term, so we can use it. Why can I involve this area? When we travel to the moon, it only takes a couple of days, really doesn't need seriously concern about the psychological perspective of the astronaut. But since we have a project to moon station and then we go to the Mars, it is a long journey, over 2.5 years or 3 years long journey. For that, human research is a very important part. So that is another reason I try to focusing on how we can manage human behavior in a safe zone, and it doesn't cause any bad situation during the travel time. Thank you.
Right, we'll cover all of these aspects here. I suppose from my perspective, I go back to Halley's Comet, was sort of my sort of early experience with space. I was a homicide detective in the mid-90s. We were accessing space-related data from Department of Lands and Mines for any sort of photographic evidence coming over our crime scenes and the like. So we were using space technology even back then, before the ICC and the like. And in terms of our media and how we've evolved into the Australian Space magazine, we predominantly came from national security, cyber security, drones and robotics, covering that advanced technology. And the more you see the multidisciplinary aspects, space comes into play very, very quickly in all of that, and our reliance on space technology for our critical infrastructure and the like. So I'll bring a little bit of sort of that investigative aspect to my questioning, particularly around, had been to plenty of postmortems, and I was going to ask sort of how we might do a postmortem in space into the future and those type of questions. But we might start with a very broad question in terms of the human challenges as we're moving into and approaching the moon and Mars, and literally the Indians, hopefully, fingers crossed, are about to land on the moon. Russia crashed into it earlier in the week as well, so it's very active. And even here in Australia, we're seeing space debris flying over the skies of Melbourne and landing on the beaches of Western Australia. So the space race is on. What are the fundamental challenges? And I'm going to maybe I might start with Ben on the actual fundamental challenges that we might well be asking ourselves in this domain as we move to the Moon and Mars.
Thanks, Chris. So look, obviously the dangers to humans going into space are two kinds: physical, psychological. I'll probably leave the physical ones to Tracy and to Gordon, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the psychological dangers. So I think there are some kind of obvious ones of being away from loved ones for a long period of time. Also being sort of in a very small space, perhaps in a claustrophobic way. I think it was a Russian cosmonaut who said, if you want to engineer manslaughter, put two people in a room together for 3 months. Some obvious psychological challenges there. Also, one that I think we don't necessarily think about too often, namely, science has proven that human well-being is importantly affected by how much green stuff is around you. Hence the sort of movements to green cities. Well, there's not much green stuff in a spaceship, is there? So, what are the implications for the mind and your well-being of being away from plants and animals and nature for many months at a time? And this is not just if you're going to Mars, but if you're going up into space for a few months, doing a stint at a space station or something like that. So these are pretty sort of bread and butter kind of obvious worries. But I think actually there are some sort of, I think astronauts are going to be suffering existential crises at certain points. I think we talk a lot about how enriching it could be to go up into space and the sort of wonder you'd experience at seeing Earth, and this has inspired people like Jeff Bezos to go and do it. But at the same time, going into space can sort of emphasize to you, give you a first-hand impression of how small Earth is in the context of the universe, and how precarious our life on Earth is, and all that is valuable on Earth. And also, I think the sort of emptiness of space around us. And these kind of thoughts can induce, in most of us, existential crises. And I mean, astronauts would be confronted with them in a more vivid way than we are here on Earth. So I think there'll be a proneness to this, and I mean, I'm sure this is already happening, but it perhaps isn't being studied that much right now. But as more of us go into space, I think this could be a real issue. I think maybe philosophers have a role here in helping to address this. I mean, we're not medical doctors, but if part of the psychological crises here are existential in nature, philosophers might be able to help, because we've had many things to say on why the smallness of Earth in the context of the universe and the finitude of human civilization and the emptiness of space, why these things don't really diminish the meaning of our lives and the value of our lives and our reasons to go on. So I think I'm not saying necessarily that astronauts should be bringing philosophical tomes up there, but there are certain things that can be extracted from the philosophical literature on these topics that I think can really sort of help astronauts to sort of stay in touch with the value of things. I think to help them to realize that in many ways, the situation they're confronted with in space is a distortion of the value facts. It's kind of leading them to sort of fail to see what the value facts are. Anyway, so there are some psychological dangers there. The other thing I wanted to say is that these dangers pose sort of practical problems to missions. You don't want astronauts getting depressed or suffering existential crises, but there are also some ethical problems here. If space is dangerous in these psychological ways and the physical ways that these guys are going to focus on, then there's a real question here about whether we can consent to going into space, I think. And should we be allowing people to go into space given the grave dangers associated, physical and mental? And here, to answer this question, I think we really need to sort of distinguish between three different groups. Private employees of private companies, government employees, and then private individuals. And I'll just very quickly say something about the first two groups. So I think on Earth, companies need to make their workplaces safe. We have workplace health and safety regulations. This is for very good reason. If you don't have these in place, then there's a worry that you're exploiting employees. So, very important. What are the sort of lessons of this for work in space? People might be up there maintaining private space stations, running a space hotel, mining asteroids for private companies. Should we be allowing people to do this if space is as dangerous as it seems to be? And can space travel be made sort of sufficiently safe to make this sort of work morally kosher? It's not entirely clear. I think there's an important difference between this sort of space travel and the space travel of astronauts who are going on missions for governments. Astronauts who are up there for perhaps studying, doing science, studying asteroids, thinking about how we could perhaps destroy an asteroid that was coming to make contact with Earth, or running sort of, maintaining satellites or space stations that were really sort of necessary for human well-being, or soldiers in space. I think these sort of humans in space, they face grave dangers too, but here those dangers might be justifiable in the same way that that soldiers on the ground, it seems permissible to allow people to be soldiers and police and doctors in a pandemic, even though these professions are hugely dangerous. But why is that permissible? It's because these are sort of necessary things for human well-being. They have massive public benefits, and there'll be big crises on Earth if we don't allow people to be involved in these professions. So there's a good case, I think, for allowing astronauts to face grave dangers, to go into space, to protect humans and for these sort of important public well-being related things. But go up there to make a lot of money mining asteroids or running a space hotel, I'm not sure we can justify allowing people to work in those careers. There's a worry that it's overly exploitative. I've got lots more to say, but I should leave it there.
Well, look, you do raise those fundamental sort of points there. And in terms of David, you've just written a paper in relation to this. How do you reflect on sort of Ben's sort of proposals there? And should we be going at all? And can it be ever made safe enough for private companies to say to their employees or whoever they're sending, we'll be looking after you?
That's a very good question. It's a not easy question we can answer as well. Because the challenge, we have so many challenges to heading to the Mars or even other moon areas. Before I just mention a couple of the obstacles, let me just say why we choose Mars. We have to know it. Everybody know it because that's very near to the Earth. And also, everybody know Mars has only 42 years old, while Earth, we have a 2023. So Mars is very new, very youngest of the planets we have. Also, Mars has one day for Mars is 24 hours and 40 minutes. So it's very much similar with the Earth. We have our timetable. Also, Mars environment is about the coldest time is -40, but normal is up to 30 degrees. It's very much we can manage that part as they have plenty of the CO2, so which actually related with the water, ice, ocean stuffs. Those things make a reason people think about Mars. But is there any obstacles? Heaps of obstacles. Normally scientists pointing out 5 major obstacles. The first one, as you know, the radiation is one of the biggest problems. As we counted here, Earth, where we're here, if we counted this one is radiation number 1, being in space, traveling, it is about 700 times more. So how can we figure it out? I'm sure space medicine experts will handle their part. Also, radiation, I'm sure they will be figured out, and that because of radiation, our human DNA, especially the nervous system, will be very badly affected. DNA and cells, and then some other tissues as well. So also cardiovascular disease. Those things also it causes cancers as well. So radiation is one of the major problems. Also, second one I want to mention about the gravities. Its gravities is slightly different, 3/8. So compared to here. So if you are about 90 kilograms, so you will be 30 for a long time during your travel. But also between from Earth to Mars, when you travel, you might not have a kind of a total weightless conditions. So that condition will make it very hard by the time you come back to readapting to Earth environment. So gravity is another big one problems. Sorry about the radiation is big problems. Gravity is also that one. Also, my colleague Ben mentioned about the being isolation or confinement. Long journey is something like a 2-bedroom house, lounge and kitchen. In that situation, you have to stay a long time. During the pandemic time, everybody experienced 2 weeks quarantine at home, bringing a lot of mental disorder. What about normal healthy men stay in the house 3 years? They will be still challenging time. So we have to figure out what kind of solution we can bring it out because that actually causes sleep loss and then some other health outcomes, a very bad one. Also, another obstacle we have to consider is sort of a distance from the Earth, long distance. That long distance, like if we go to the moon, it only if something happening, it can communicate very easily. Also, if you are on Earth orbit, if something happening, you can come back in a couple of hours to the Earth. But the moon at the Mars travel, you literally have no chance to come back. You have to keep going. In that case, it's another very, very hard distance. Loneliness, if you astronaut have a family, they will make a loneliness, missing family. So those things also big problem. Technology will improve gradually, but they still think about those things. Also space temperature, also pressure, also lightning, noisy, also lack of the space for individual space. You can work together in a small space, but sometimes you need your free time. But your colleagues always there, even you go toilet, they're gonna be very, very uncomfortable place. Also, speed is main problems. If you travel to overseas using airplane, that is only 1,000 kilometers per hour. But travel to the Mars, the spacecraft take about 40 times faster than the airplane travel. So you might use mobile phone 4G and 5G. So space travel time is a 4G speed. So in that case, if you just relax, the human can't survive it. So we have to have a special things. So those things we have to figure out. I'm sure it is on the way to figure out. By the time 2033, when the NASA want to do that, heading there, I'm sure before that time it will be figured out. Anyhow, so those things are major issues, but I'm sure the other my colleagues will handle more.
Thank you, David. So it sounds pretty easy, straightforward. And we'll come to Tracy and now, but also Gordon as two sort of medical doctors, just talk about the impacts of space on the human body and also some of the research that you might be connected with. But Tracy, your general thoughts on humans in space and the human body?
Look, it is a lot of problems that, and a lot of solutions too that have been worked through. And I think just to one of your points, Ben, in terms of should we be sending people in space, I think it's all about risk. It's all about understanding the risks and fully explaining the risks to individuals. Not all about, but that's part of it. And I think a lot of the research that's being done at the moment is actually trying to identify in more detail what those risks actually are, and then what are possible things in place to mitigate those risks. So it's kind of public health and workplace health and safety 101 in many ways, to fully understand. We know a lot about, a good analogue, I think, of space travellers travelling to Mars are the early explorers. You know, back in the 1600s or whatever, when people were heading to this place, or the 1700s, they really weren't sure what they were going into. They were away from home a long time. They had, problems with confinement. They, maybe stopped off at Mauritius on the way and sent a letter back home, which would be take months and months to get back. But they were really going into the unknown. And I think the big thing about space is that there are still a lot of unknowns, but there's a lot of data and information we've got over the last few years from people living on the International Space Station, from people gradually increasing their time in space. So I think we do understand the risks a lot better than we used to, and we do have a lot of measures in place to mitigate them. But I also wanted to pick up on the point that, I think, and I'll let Gordon talk about some of the more sort of technical, physical things, but I think that it's not only the psychological issues that are important, but the psychosocial issues as well. Putting a group of humans together into a space, as you mentioned, Ben, is difficult, not only in terms of their own individual psychology, but in terms of mission impact as well. And I've done an analogue to this, if you like, when I deployed to Africa in the mid-1990s. 6 months in the middle of Africa. Back then there was no internet. We had no mobile phones. We could ring up every couple of weeks on a payphone, had to buy a card and put into. And I observed people living in that fishbowl environment where we were working together 24/7. Some of us had our own rooms. I was lucky enough to have it. Not everybody did. We lived, some of the people lived in multi-bed rooms. And I saw people decompensate and really not being able to get away and do their normal things that make them healthy, and being able to then, I saw the impacts that had on the team cohesion, the ability to do the job, some decision making and all these sort of things. So I think there's a lot of work going on at the moment using other analogues. Antarctica is a great example of an analogue where people are looking at this sort of thing. But I think that's an area that still needs a lot more research to fully understand the risks of that. And how do you screen that? How do you optimise the group of people that are going together and find ways for them to get along, again, for personal health reasons, but also for mission effectiveness and being able to complete the mission as well?
Thanks, Tracy. And Gordon, maybe cover off pre-session and the unknowns that are potentially there on the human body, the unknown reaction to medicine, changes in our DNA. Just cover off on some of those.
How much time have we got,
Yeah,
Chris?
well, we've got plenty of time. That's a good thing.
All right. Going last is hard because there's so many points I'd love to pick up on from the other panellists as well. And I think perhaps if I do touch on some of those medical things in a moment, but I just wanted to pick up on something that Ben said about the psychological aspects of isolation. And David covered, the environmental challenges really well. But Ben, the fact that you said plants are important, and that's certainly been borne out by the anecdotal reports from the International Space Station astronauts, who value having anything green up there in this really austere technical environment. There's actually work going on in Australia at the moment looking at the effectiveness of using fractal patterns and plants and patterns from nature to improve psychological health and reduce stress. And I think that's a strategy that could be looked at for space habitat designs and spacecraft. So plants will not only serve a purpose for nutrition and serve a purpose for oxygen creation, but potentially also for psychological health. So I think that's a fascinating area, and there is actually a Plants for Space ARC research program in Australia that's looking at the whole range of applications for plants in austere environments. So great point. The environmental challenges that David highlighted do lead to a number of medical problems, and there are still lots of unknowns. The microgravity issue, for example, which is probably the most well-known and relatable environmental factor of space, people floating around on the International Space Station. When we go to Mars, we're going to be exposed to that microgravity environment for 7 or 8 months outbound, 7 or 8 months inbound, and then, of course, partial gravity on the surface. we don't know much about partial gravity, but we also don't know the cumulative effect of that long-term microgravity exposure, which has so many medical and physiological effects on the cardiovascular system with fluid shifts, on the eye. Most people don't realise that astronauts' vision often changes in microgravity, and it can be a persistent change on return to Earth. Changes to the immune system, where immunity is decreased, your ability to fight infection or fight cancer cells diminishes, and of course the risk of cancer cells actually generating in the radiation environment is probably increased, as is the generation of viruses within the body. So that's a problem. The effect of the microgravity environment on balance and posture is probably one of the important ones, because we don't have much to mitigate that. At the moment, we can mitigate the bone and muscle deconditioning that occurs because we have good exercise programs. On the International Space Station, astronauts exercise for 2 hours every day, doing both cardio and weightlifting exercises. But, in the small spacecraft that go to Mars, because of the mass and volume problem, we can't necessarily take all that same equipment. So we have to come up with alternative measures to do that. But we kind of know how to do that. And we have drugs that we can give astronauts, the same drugs we give to osteoporosis patients, for example, to help preserve bones. But one of the things we don't really know how to do well is preserve the vestibular system, the balance and posture system. In microgravity, your balance system becomes de-adapted to gravity. It becomes used to this new floating weightless environment where there is no up or down. You don't bear weight through your muscles to support you in a gravity environment. There's no sense of where gravity is coming from any senses. And then suddenly you land on Mars, there's suddenly 3/8 gravity. It may as well be Earth gravity, but it's the transition that's the problem. So you have a de-adapted astronaut suddenly having to readapt to gravity where there are no services, there's no rehabilitation, there's no one there to help you from the spacecraft and carry you away on a plinth. You just have to do it. So I think NASA has a lot, for example, NASA, as one of the international agencies, has concern about what happens if there is an emergency on the spacecraft on landing and the astronauts have to egress in a really urgent way. Will they be able to run away bravely? Will they be able to actually ambulate sufficiently with their balance system, having just flown in space for 7 or 8 months? So that's a problem which has no good solution at the moment, and nor does the immune system problem either. Our ability to fight infection, we know, diminishes in space, and all these problems are multifactorial. So the environmental aspects that David spoke of, you can't look at in isolation. You've got to look at the interaction between all those environmental factors and how they affect, for example, the immune system. And stress and isolation, I think, plays a huge role in how our immune system responds, but then add gravity, add radiation to that. We can study this to a certain and limited extent on Earth, so some of the research that we have on these problems, we can get from Earth analogues such as Antarctica, such as desert analogue facilities around the world. But you can't simulate everything related to space. They generally look mostly at the isolation and confinement aspects. But unless you do a parabolic flight, you can't simulate microgravity well, unless you wouldn't ethically expose people to the sort of radiation environments that we would see in deep space beyond the Earth's magnetosphere. So there are limitations in the data, and certainly limitations in how we can see how those factors interact. So medically, there's a lot of problems. So bone, muscle, cardiovascular system, immune system, balance system. The list is very long, and I wish we had all night to talk about it, because I can, if you want.
Well, one question I have is, how much are we learning out of those changes in the human body and the human reaction in space? Are we learning anything more about the human body that we are now able to apply in general medical practice?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's so much science that's come from space. I mean, the International Space Station is a huge research laboratory on orbit that's generated so many benefits for the planet, over the 23 years that's been accrued. But medically, yes, looking at, new materials, lightweight materials for the creation of prostheses and surgical implements, looking at new ways to look at and scan and image bone loss, for example, in osteoporosis patients, managing muscular dystrophy patients, patients with prolonged immobility, which is an analogue or an Earth-based variant of what you have in microgravity. If you have an immobile patient, sedentary patient, say with a spinal cord injury, they get the same deconditioning that you might see in an astronaut in microgravity. So there's a lot of crossover, and I think we're going to learn a lot more about immune system function from a lot of the studies, and then that's going to help people on Earth with immune deficiency problems. So yes, there are many, many potential spin-offs, and we've seen a lot of them already.
Maybe a little bit more about the research that ANU is involved with, and Tracy also with maybe the iLaunch program. Just in terms of the research scope that ANU sort of has in this domain.
Sure. So one of the things I was going to add to that list was telehealth and virtual sort of, because the space station sometimes has doctors who are astronauts, but sometimes doesn't. So developing those scanning techniques and then sending them back to Earth, getting guidance, all of these things, this telehealth thing has also boomed, I guess, with going into space. And one of the things we're working on is a system that will look at putting sensors on people, connecting them to a decoding system or platform, decoding them, and then integrating it with this software that we're developing here called digital twin software, then, recoding it and sending it back to Earth. So a whole system of monitoring. That what the digital twin project part of it is all about is actually creating from real patient data, you're mirroring or twinning that physiological data into a computer, into a virtual sort of situation. And that way you can better understand what's going on, what are the changes that are happening in space, what are the changes that are happening to individual physiology, and you're able to then sort of use that as a way to monitoring people. But it also is useful if you think about it as a way to sort of measure the risk again, as I was saying. So if you, particularly when you're looking at people who aren't professional astronauts going into space, because astronauts train for years and years and years and years, and they go through all sorts of training, all sorts of screening before they go up. So their bodies and minds are known inside out, really, in terms of, what are their risk factors and everything else for having a medical emergency. But if we start talking about, people going up to work on the moon or an asteroid, or space tourists going to that space hotel and drinking their space pina coladas by the space pool, which is my ambition, actually, in space. But, if we're looking at those people, and they're people, there'll be old people like me who want to go but have pre-existing conditions. So how can we tell if they're going to be fit to go into space? What are the risks associated with that? How can we explain that risk to them? So in the digital twin, we've actually had a medical student here at ANU use this software to sort of look at what a person with cardiac failure would be like. What would happen to them when they go into space with the microgravity, with the other stresses that we've heard about already? What happens to their cardiovascular system? And, okay, so if there is a problem, what interventions could be done? Do they need more fluid? Do they need less fluid? All of these things, what are the interventions that might need to happen to reduce that risk? And if we put that intervention in place, are there other effects on the body that could result from that intervention? And the end result is, are they actually fit? Is it too much risk for this individual to go into space to the extent where we'd say, no, you can't? Or is there just enough risk so we say to the patient, well, here's what your risk is, do you still want to go to space? So we think that this software could be a way to be able to, as I said, monitor people in space, but also screen people before they go. Not only that, but of course that could be used in other environments as well to look at, screening and fitness and all of these things as well. So that's one of the things we're focusing on under the big iLaunch program that's happening. And we hope to sort of get that research underway in the next few months and eventually to fly this monitoring system in space. That's the ambition.
Do we understand enough about the diversity of humans in space? Traditionally it's been males, but again, females, even people with disabilities of the like, NASA's starting to think about that as well. What's the male, female, gender and opportunities for people with disabilities in this area?
Yeah, much like aviation has been historically, the astronaut corps that we've sent to space it's been a very strong male predominance in gender bias in that way. So we have much more data on males and females in space, so we need more females. I mean, having said that though, of course, quite a few females have flown, and in fact the US astronaut with the most cumulative hours in space is Peggy Whitson, who was, I think she's now working with Axiom Space, but we do need more data, and we certainly need to look more at people with medical problems in space. We don't have any data because the astronauts who have gone to space have been, as Tracy said, highly screened, very healthy, fighter pilot fit kind of people, and we now are potentially going to have a population going to space who are not that. But you're right, it's not NASA, but ESA have actually, in their last astronaut intake, specifically gone out and tried to select astronauts who are differently abled or with certain medical conditions to bring them into the program and train them up as astronauts. And they've actually recruited a British orthopaedic surgeon, Paralympian, who is an amputee. And they're going to hopefully fly him. I think he's in the reserve astronauts for ESA, but he is probably he'll be the first differently abled person. They were actually, I think, looking for people with paraplegia as well, because in space you don't need to be using the lower part of your body. You're floating around, and in fact, in some ways, from a physiological point of view, it may be an advantage to have that. So I think there's yes, a lot more work that needs to be done. But if this much broader cohort of people are going to fly to space, we need to gather that data.
Go, Tracy.
Yeah, I was going to say there's also been some parabolic flight missions that have looked at people with various different types of disabilities, blind people, deaf people. How could they operate in space? Are there some advantages that they have for having one sense not there and others sort of, I guess, amplified, if you want to use lay terms? So there is some work. And of course, also from the space tourism point of view, getting people up to experience, moving around without being sort of, constrained to a wheelchair as well. So that is certainly an area that's being looked at, getting away from that mindset that you have to be this perfect superhuman specimen that has traditionally been what we see astronauts as, and what astronauts have been, really.
Welcome, and I'll open the floor to questions. Has anyone got any questions at this stage or want to dive into a particular area? I was just going to fire to Ben on that ethically. Does that overcome any ethics where potentially you go into space for the benefit of long-term humankind and exploration of space?
Well, look, I think when it comes to private individuals going into space, say for tourism, there's something called the harm principle in philosophy, which I think a lot of people accept and find intuitive, and that basically says your freedom to swing your fist ends at the tip of my nose. So, so long as you don't harm anyone else, well, you can do whatever the heck you like. It's an idea that many of us find intuitive. And if that principle's true, then you should be able to go up into space. If you can pay for it, why not allow anyone to go up into space and take whatever risks are involved? So I think that's something that would support the sort of, although Tracy I think you did accept that there might be some people who didn't pass, who weren't sufficiently healthy to be allowed to go into space. And I'm interested in whether you think that is just because it could jeopardize, it could endanger others, or, suppose someone the risks for them were determined to be very, very great, but they wanted to do it and they could pay their own way, and if something went wrong, it wouldn't jeopardize anyone else. Do you think they should be allowed to go up?
Well, I think, in aerospace medicine, we look at it, what are the risks to the individual? What are the risks to others? What are the risks to the mission? And to some extent, what are the reputational risks as well? I think that's also part of it for a commercial company. Do they want a whole heap of old people dying in space as well? I think that comes into it as well. So again, coming from the, aviation medicine or aerospace medicine background, there are certainly some individuals who we say you can't fly planes anymore because the risks in all of those, particularly the individual and the risk to mission, and the risk to others, I suppose all three are such that it's not an acceptable risk for, say, the Air Force to take with fighter pilots. And I think that will come into it as well. But I do see your point, if you're willing to pay. People ask me often, would I go into space? And I say, my answer is, yes, even if there was only a 50% chance if I'd come back alive, I'd still go into space. So if I take that argument, that's what I'd do for myself.
Yep.
So is it everybody's right to make that decision themselves? Maybe it is.
So I actually don't accept that harm principle myself. And I think, we don't allow people to, civilians to run into burning buildings to save people who might be in danger there. We say, wait for the fire brigade. So there are certain risks we don't allow people to take, even when they're not endangering others. but I guess my feeling is that maybe we should allow people to go into space as space tourists, so we shouldn't prohibit it. But there might still be something morally off about spending that much money on doing that when there are so many people who are suffering on Earth and who, desperately need help and resources. I mean, when the billionaires were going into space last year, it didn't sit well with me, and with many of my friends as well. So I think, but if space travel for tourists becomes way cheaper, that might change things. But I'm not sure it would, to be honest, but it might.
Very good.
May I respond? I think to address the point of the safety aspects to others, to self, to mission, I think the mission criticality of the astronaut that you're talking about is key here. So if you're talking about a professional exploration mission where it is a mission that the astronauts have to perform, they have to achieve a certain goal, then you want to make sure that they're fit and healthy and performing at their maximum. So it's not just about fitness, it's about actual maximisation of performance. If you talk about tourists and people going to space for fun, they're not a safety critical role. They might inconvenience others. I don't think they would necessarily harm others, but I think then and they're probably spending their own money to do it. But I think, you've got to look at commercial spaceflight and the missions for tourist purposes now in a similar way to how we experienced the early days of aviation. After the First World War, a lot of the aviators came out of the military and were lost for something to fly, so they started doing barnstorming. They were flying biplanes, they were flying tourists for fun, literally barnstorming through barn doors and all that kind of stuff, aerobatics, and it was all for giggles. But eventually somebody realised we can actually do this purposefully. We can fly from point A to point B, we can carry mail, we can carry cargo, we can carry patients, we can go from this city to that in a third of the time it would take on a horse or in a vehicle. So I think what we're seeing now potentially is a mirror image of that in the early days of commercial spaceflight, where it will become purposeful transport that benefits humanity at some point. It won't just be for giggles, and that's my sort of feeling of where it might go. And as a historian, David, you might have comments on that from a historical perspective.
Just before you answer that, David, just one question. Just for the audience, who would go to space as a space tourist? Just a show of hands. Okay, so who would go to Mars on a 3-year mission, having heard the impacts on the body? So it's about half, I would suspect. Who's learned a lot more on the long-term impacts and the sort of range of impact space has on the human body? Is it more? Or is it more than what you thought, impact? Yeah, so a lot of nods to say yes. David, maybe over to you to answer Gordon's question on that in terms of the historical approach to this.
That's not easy questions. We have always so many multiple answers. We think that is right. So even our speakers might slightly have a different perspective. Also, that means we are still far away to go make sure everything is perfect. In relation to the Gordon's one, I want to talk about the risk management. It's all related to the risk and safety stuffs. So how can we reduce the risk rate during the travel times? Those things are also medically we can handle, but also psychologically, I want to describe a little bit about the psychological stability. How can we mentally stabilizing each individual astronaut during the travels? For that, I sort of was thinking about one of my last research just published by aerospace journals. In that, I just mentioned about there are a lot of issues going on, how can we selecting astronauts, but for that one, we also have to consider the kind of the behavior, internal behaviors, including addictions. Some kind of bad addictions looks normal, but when they are in the space, those addiction behaviors will coming above the space, above the behavior space, such as, I'm not saying if this is perfect, but a lot of different addictions will cause some problems. So those things, but how we handle in the space, we call space community during the travels. We have to see everyday colleagues. We can't be smiling and having fun all the times. But in terms of the non-scientific influence of the astronaut, it is good to think about how to improve the metaphysical source of each individuals. For that, I just talk about a little bit about the positive attitude on also willpower and also self-sacrifice. In that case, when the emergency situation, mechanical, technical emergency situation happening, somebody have to volunteer to go out and fix it. But by that time, when that person coming back into the space ship, they might not have enough oxygen. Who gonna volunteers? So in that case, we have to consider self-sacrifice, the rate who has more that kind of behaviors. Also, responsibility and perseverance. So when the all mechanical, scientific things are going well, medical systems going well, that's fine. But when there's something unusual things are happening, we have to think about each individual astronaut's behavior, especially based on this kind of the internal psychological behavior. So in that case, it is not easy. Also, this area of the research, we can't show you exactly visible data, but also some experiment might bring some results, but still it is a long way to go, but it is important part.
Again, any questions from the audience? We've got one here. Okay, we've got a couple.
Just wonder about what studies have been done on the impact of BMI on space travel, and also on longevity, and also on healing, and also on development and contraception and fertility. So a lot of questions, but they're really relevant if you're thinking 3 years.
I might start, I don't know about particularly studies of BMI, but one of the problems there obviously is fit of equipment. So, can you build, I mean, I think that was Andy Thomas's problem, wasn't it, at one stage, about getting into his spacesuit, wasn't it, I think?
I'm not sure in terms of size, but there's certainly been issues with female-male differences in size in terms of EVA suit fitment, and that's been a recent problem on the International Space Station where an EVA had to be cancelled. They didn't have the right fit of suit for the astronauts.
So, yeah, so I think it's more about the fit of the safety equipment rather than I don't think there's been any work on the actual health effects from a high BMI. Are you aware of any?
DCI, I'll talk
Okay, yeah. Oh, DCI,
so
yes, yeah.
Yeah, look, there's probably not a lot of actual data because most people who fly to space have been, very, very fit individuals with BMIs probably in a very normal range. Although, very muscly individuals, of course, can have lots of muscle, which increases your BMI without it being fat per se. The study that I'm thinking of really is the relationship between body fat content and decompression sickness. Decompression sickness is a risk with space operations because of the change in pressure between habitats or spacecraft and suits, for example, which are much lower pressure inside, and there's a risk of the bend, so decompression sickness. And there is evidence to suggest that a higher BMI and body fat content is associated with a slightly increased risk of decompression illness, and certainly on the NASA table of risk things that could be risk managed in that sense, because nitrogen, which is the gas that is involved in decompression sickness, is more soluble in fatty tissue, so you have theoretically a higher nitrogen load in the body, which is that risk. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the list of other questions. Contraception, yeah, okay. So I mean, contraception is used routinely in space for menstrual suppression in female astronauts to try and avoid the problem of menstruation because blood clogs up the filters in the sewage system on the ISS in simple terms. So they have to do that. But the problem has arisen in that, and there's studies going on at the moment in terms of the risk of coagulability. There was a case only a couple of years ago where one of the astronauts on the International Space Station was incidentally found in a study of other things to have a clot in the internal jugular vein. So there was a thrombosis here, which is extremely dangerous. They had to anticoagulate the astronaut on orbit, try and stabilise the clot before they would even think about getting them home. And they managed to do that, and the astronaut came home. But the risk there is that oral contraception, if you're using it for that purpose, that in itself is a thrombophilic risk. you increase the risk of clotting by taking the pill. So that plus this potential interaction with microgravity, which we think is happening with the fluid shifts and the blood flow in the venous system, is a previously unrecognised problem, and more work is needed there. So do we need to screen, for example, astronauts for coagulation problems before they go to space? Do we need to find an alternative method of menstrual suppression? All these questions still yet to be answered. Fertility, I think more work to be done there. I mean, as I say, not many females have flown to space. There's been no demonstration of a change in fertility in male astronauts other than the old chestnut, which always seems to pop up in the medical literature, that aviators and seemingly astronauts have more girls than boys. I don't know that that's true. I think it's a bit of a myth and legend, but some of the data suggests that there's a gender bias in offspring. But we need to know about these things. We need to know about reproduction. We need to know about fertility if we ever want to colonise another planet. If we want to be a spacefaring society and have a colony on Mars at some point, or even the Moon, but certainly Mars, we need to reproduce there. And we know very little about the reproductive effects of that harsh environment on human physiology of reproduction.
And
so
also,
great question.
in that context, the children, the actual children that are born, what is that going to do to them being born in a sort of lower gravity environment? Socialisation, if you've only got a small amount of people there, all of these issues. A lot of people are thinking about this stuff, I think, but obviously there's a lot more to go before we get to that point. The other point I'd say about that is that the contraception is a great example of trying to solve a practical problem, but having a health risk. So, as Gordon said, it's all these interactions. You can put in place risk mitigators, but they might itself increase risk in another area. So it's like chasing something around to get the best result.
Great. Healing.
So certainly there are effects on, the immune system and everything else in space.
You don't heal faster, do you?
No, I don't. I think it's the opposite way around. If anything, Gordon, are you aware of any specific studies in that?
Yeah, look, I think that's one of the knowledge gaps that NASA has in terms of wound healing. Luckily, there haven't been too many major wounds that have needed healing, but interestingly, there have been some developments in wound closure technologies in Australia that NASA has actually been quite interested in. So there has been work done here looking at different ways to close wounds which doesn't involve suturing and all that kind of stuff. I'm not aware of any hard evidence to say that tissues heal faster or slower. But it's just a question of how you manage them in a microgravity environment in terms of blood and fluids and all that sort of stuff.
But you would think the bones obviously wouldn't heal as well.
Bones different, yeah. More information
because of the
needed
lack
on
of
bones.
gravity. That's part of the healing process. Yeah.
Yep, but NASA says they need more data on that. There is a theoretical risk that bones do not heal as well because you need loading on a bone to some extent. That's why animals walk on fractured limbs, because they heal faster. Painful, but nonetheless it works. But loading actually creates bone, and it's the unloading in space that demineralizes bone. So there is that thing. But if you get a fracture, how does that affect the fracture healing? Theoretically, it could be very slow, but we don't actually know because we haven't been there yet.
Great question. Sounds like you've given a lot of thought to going into space to me, but we'll take the next question. Thank you.
So my question relates to the human factors side around autonomy, and I presume the increased level of autonomy and autonomous systems for those missions, and then the ability for the people, the crew, to be able to respond to emergencies if they come up, or I guess their level of engagement with their day-to-day duties and just their life when presumably a lot of what they're doing is all taken care of on the mission.
That is a really important point, and autonomy in clinical care of astronauts is a problem that needs to be solved, because as you rightly say, the further you go into space, with the comms delay, the 40-minute turnaround time potentially in communications, the crew have to be able to act autonomously in whatever emergency situation, including medical. Now, it's highly probable that a physician will fly on any missions beyond the Earth-Moon system, and they will be extended skills trained individuals, and they will need some sort of extensive backup in terms of AR, VR, basically systems on board the spacecraft that can help, because they're not going to have a flight surgeon on the ground with immediate contactability to help them out. So they need that autonomous ability. It's just a question of what technologies can we develop to support that. Robotics, AI, there's that kind of stuff that certainly being looked at the moment, but they need to be able to deal with those problems, and it's only going to be 20 minutes or 40 minutes later they get some confirmation from the ground, because they're not even going to be able to transmit the images or the data in real time like they can at the moment. So crew autonomy is the key. Cross-training the crew, of course, not only just having a physician on board, but actually having all the crew trained in medical skills so that there is that redundancy. So autonomy and redundancy are going to be critical. I don't know that we have fully developed the systems. The monitoring systems like ANU are working on, for example, will be helpful, but the computerised AI and other support systems are still being developed.
Yeah, and obviously they have to be cross-trained because the doctor could be the one who's ill. And there's, of course, a famous case. It's my famous photo that I have, favourite photo I have of the Russian doctor in Antarctica who had to take out his own appendix because he was the N of 1. And so there's a great picture of him with a mirror and the cook who scrubbed up as an assistant under some, just a few painkillers and taking out his own appendix. So obviously...
Do you have a bottle of brandy or something as well?
Well, vodka. One would think vodka.
But yes. A bar on the spaceship as well.
Exactly.
Next, this lady here in the green.
So I was going back to the conversation about the health of people in space and risk management. Sorry, I've got it written down just so I could remember. So with the increased amount of private companies taking people to space, how did a nation supposed to ensure that they're appropriately managing risks in space and looking after people's health in space? Just because it's one thing to say that you're happy to die in space, but if you die 6 months into a 3-year trip, it will have psychological impacts on people and stuff like that. So how do we just ensure that these private companies aren't just taking the money and are actually appropriately risk managing?
David, I might go to David on that one.
Yeah, that's a good question. We have to think about the space insurance if we want to go with the commercial flight to make sure everything is perfect. But it is important because the commercial flight, they actually have a looking for benefits. At the moment, if you have a short flight, very short flight is about the 250,000 to 500,000. But if you go a long flight, it's about 50 to 55 million per person. So it's, I'm sure they get some benefit, but meantime, are they really looking after all the each travelers' secure stuff? Maybe we have to look at the details of each companies. We have so far we have seven different commercial companies. As you all knows about the Virgin Galaxy, SpaceX, also Blue Origin and Origin Spam, and also Boeing start to join that part. Also Space Adventure, also one Spanish one called Zero to Infinity. So they might have their own policies. If you want to travel with them, you need to look at the detail, but also for your sake of the safety, space insurance, that's another industry they're creating. So that's something we have to look at.
Wonderful, thank you.
I'll just add a little bit to that as well. First of all, if I was a billionaire, I'd rather take the risk in space than in a deep sort of ocean submersible, just saying, sorry, too soon. But there's a lot of work being done on the regulation side of things as well, in terms of, fitness, passenger fitness, all of that sort of stuff. The FAA in America is leading a lot of this sort of stuff, but even our CASA, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority in Australia, is also looking at how they might put regulations in place to ensure that there are standards met, there are standards set and standards met by commercial companies as well. So there's quite a bit going on in that regulatory space as well.
And the regulatory space applies primarily to the crew, I think, in terms of same as aviation, they've got to meet certain fitness standards. Lots of former NASA flight surgeons are now working in these private companies and doing a lot of that stuff, and there have been centrifuge studies done in various centres looking at the G profiles of the suborbital flights and the impact on the crew, but also on even, general, the passengers. But, from a regulatory point of view on the passengers, and it comes to the insurance thing, it's pay your money and take your risk, really. The companies try to minimally restrict medically. It comes down to informed consent, and this is something my colleagues might want to comment on, but, assuming that they're of age, can give informed consent and able to consent, and, are not going to cause a sudden issue that's going to be a risk to the flight in some way, then I don't think the companies are going to restrict them. I don't think that's the intent. And, you know, I'm sure that there is an argument that people die on commercial aircraft every day and people die on cruise ships every day. In fact, they want to take their last breath, you know, on a cruise ship in the middle of the Pacific or in the Caribbean, that's fine, and they do. So it might be the same sort of approach, but from a crew point of view, they're the safe, that's what I said earlier, the safety critical bit. There's got to be a lot of regulation and screening around that.
Two more. We've got this lady here.
Can I just chime in and just...
I was about to say, but keep the answer short.
Quick comment, yeah. Regarding informed consent, I mean, one thing you could do to try and get informed consent is, you know, give people the VR goggles and help them to get some sense of what it would be like to actually go up there. But then you've got to wonder, well, what's the point of going, you know, if you've had such a vivid depiction of what it's like to go? So, you know, it kind of defeats the point in a way to give them too much information about what it's like. So there's a kind of catch-22 there in a way.
That could be an opportunity in its own right? If you get recreated on Earth, that could be a business there right now.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
okay, go. Yes, this man here.
Sorry, we draw our connections back to the early seafarers, and one of the big problems that they faced was scurvy. It made a lot of people sick and it killed a lot of people. And the simple fix for that was vitamin C, taking lemons and limes. Apart from radiation and trying to mitigate those effects on the human body, what do you perceive would be our next big hurdle? What's our space scurvy?
Well, I think the whole issue of food and water and nutrition and everything else is incredibly important. And there's a lot of work being done on that, both in Australia and internationally, in terms of making sure. So I know you're not being specific to food, but I think it's worth mentioning that you know, understanding what are the nutritional requirements. You know, you'll probably need food to be dropped. You'll need to be able to grow it, but you'd also maybe need to do a food drop on Mars to make sure that they have enough, you know, food and water to be able to last that length of time. So you've got to make sure it you know, it's not destroyed by radiation. You need to make sure that it's, you know, going to last, the shelf life, is, you know, like some of the wrap packs we've had in the past, making sure the shelf life is good, but also, you know, making sure it tastes good too, because that's a morale, that's a, you know, psychological issue as well, having food that tastes good, you know, space pizza, you want that to taste really nice and fresh. But I think they're all issues that relate to food and knowing a bit more about food and nutrition. But in terms of picking one specific issue, I don't know, it's hard, isn't it?
Scurvy was an unknown unknown.
Yeah.
We only discovered it because we went. And there are going to be unknown unknowns in space that we will only discover when we're there and try and find a solution to, and that will be the next scurvy. Yeah? Because, I mean, we have a lot of known unknowns that we're trying to find solutions to right now. You know, I think potentially, you know, bone is one of the things, you know, just figuring out how to keep astronaut bones healthy. The number of people that's going to help on Earth with osteoporosis is going to be huge. So that's not bone, that's not scurvy, that's rickets. That's our space rickets, but or osteoporosis. But that's probably one of them. Oh gosh, there are so many. But I think, yeah, it's the unknowns that we need to discover, find a solution to, and that's going to help people on Earth.
And I think you touched on it before, that transition from various different levels of gravity as well.
Exactly.
And being able to then operate successfully on Mars. And
David, a quick response on that one?
Yeah, can I just say a little bit about how they managing the sleeping times? I know that if you go space, they don't have day and night. It's going to be all the times dark. So if they don't set the sleeping times, there will be another big things. Also, they have to keep the routines. So that will be another big obstacles. There are some, I'm sure, the medical sleeping tablet they will be developing there because of a long journey they don't want to do. So some sleeping tablet may be a temporary solution to figure out the long journey path, but that's still only 3 days maximum, I see it. So it's sleeping is another big problems.
Okay, we'll keep going. We're going to go a little bit over time because it's warming up now. But this lady, this lady here.
Hi, you've alluded to the need for more data, more diverse groups of people to adequately assess risk. I'm just wondering where we're at in terms of the public and the private sectors sharing data, or the private companies even actually collecting health data from their space tourists, and are they sharing it? And you know, in terms of sort of a public health space medicine registry, where we're at with that?
Certainly, you know, Gordon and I are fellows of the Aerospace Medicine Association in the US, and that is a forum that is used by, and, you know, we probably know all the space doctors working in the industry, I guess, over in the US and beyond. So that is a forum for, you know, presenting scientific articles, doing collaborations and all that sort of thing. So there is a lot of information being shared, even just on protocols and, you know, procedures and all that sort of stuff. I'm sure, though, there is an element of commercial sensitivity. You know, obviously all these companies are looking for an edge in some way. But certainly I've been to a lot of presentations talking about some of the, you know, the findings and everything else. I don't know if you have specifically sort of any knowledge in this area, Gordon, or?
No, well, not detailed knowledge, no, but I mean, I know that the commercial companies are certainly flying research. Axiom, you know, via SpaceX, on their missions have flown a number of medical experiments and used their commercial astronauts to study things such as wearable monitoring, portable ultrasounds, and that sort of stuff. Presumably they're not doing that for fun. They must be going to publish this stuff somewhere. I haven't seen it yet, but you know, that was, I can't remember which Axiom mission that was now. It was one of the very early, you know, full civilian crews that flew. It was actually the one that was with the female astronaut who was the representing a hospital in the US. She was a med tech. But anyway, she was involved in some of that data collection when they were in space. So it's being done, but you know, they're not going to be keeping that stuff to themselves. They're doing that because they're in space. They have that opportunity. They obviously have the consent of the people flying to do the experiments themselves or on themselves. So again, it comes down to an experimental consent protocol. But yeah, look, I don't think in that sense it would be kept. Any other data that might be collected for commercial purposes, sure. I mean, they might be keeping that to themselves. Can't hear you.
Pooling data. Not that I'm aware of. I'm not sure of a registry of information.
But there's a lack of data overall anyway.
Yeah, not sure.
But obviously NASA and the, you know, different space programs do have a comprehensive sort of registry of data and information, and
researchers around the world can apply to access that and do research on data that they have. So it is available from the agencies. Commercial companies, I'm not so sure.
All right, we're down to the last two. That lady there, and then we'll come and finish with the front row. Or just go.
You had mentioned that once, I guess, you're in space, there's a lot of stress on a lot of different physiological systems. And I know that this is many years in the future, but when we start to, well, hopefully when we start to colonize other planets with very different gravitational environments and all of those different stressors, do you see humans starting to evolve differently in those environments? And if so, is there, say, one system that would be most significantly impacted by that evolution, or would it all kind of evolve in tandem?
Darwin's theory?
look, I'm a big sci-fi fan, and but I think the answer is, again, we don't know, but I think it's very likely. There's a really good show called The Expanse. I don't know if anybody's seen it here. That's got actually some really good physiological aspects about, you know, how when the Martians return to Earth, you know, the fact that they have to acclimatise, you know, the belters who live in the asteroid belt, how they're born in microgravity and those sort of things, and therefore they can't survive on Earth at all. So I think sci-fi drives a lot of this thought about where we could go and what does this mean and what is, you know, where's humankind going to go. So it might sound a bit flippant, but I think it's very likely that, you know, we will see humans evolve to live on this planet. They'll evolve to live on, you know, the other planets to the degree that they're able to. How long that takes, generational versus short-term, again, I think that's one of it's a known unknown, that one. You know, so yeah, good question.
And I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question well, but I think I get the gist of it. So, you know, this is a really interesting question that we addressed earlier with colonisation, reproduction. There's really nothing that we know about embryological development, paediatric development in these environments. So if you did reproduce and have children in these low-gravity environments, what does that do to neural tube development? What does that do to muscle development, to bones, epiphyseal closure, growth, even endocrine responses? We don't know, you know, and you may well end up with very thin-legged, very tall children because they're actually developing in a low G environment with very poorly conditioned cardiovascular reflexes, and they may never be able to come back to Earth. But, you know, this is, again, science fiction thinking, hypothesising what it might be like.
They look like Martians.
They might look like they'd be human Martians, essentially, because they would grow up in that environment. But we don't know, you know, but is it even possible for humans to develop in that low-gravity environment and for neural tubes to close and all that stuff? We just don't know.
And there's also the cyborg approach to that too, where exoskeleton, you know, mechanical skeletons
to
and
bring them back to
computer
Earth,
brain interface.
The Borg.
The
Could be assimilated. Oh, no.
Go, last question here.
Hi, yeah, bit of pressure because it's the last question. Thank you all. This has been really interesting. This is more, you're looking at it from a science and a medical and a sort of point of view. Just because you're sort of looking at that, should we be going into space? Like, you know, it's probably more for Ben, but, you know, you're looking at it from a pure science point of view. Yeah, we want to be able to do it. We can do it theoretically and everything. But are we asking that broader question about should we go into space? Because if you look at what's happened to the world, the big companies are driving, you know, mining and everything, and how would that shape what you do?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question that's asked a lot, and it was asked a lot during the Apollo missions and in the 60s. I think there's, you know, many layers to it. The way I see it is that, you know, whenever we as humans are given challenges to solve, whether it be in the 1700s with, you know, the voyages out to this part of the world or whatever, be it at war, during war, they're stimuli to make changes that end up actually being able to be applicable to other, you know, people back on Earth or back in the... So there's many inventions that have come from war, like, you know, plastic surgery, a lot of the orthopedic stuff all started to come out of World War I. So I see space as another challenge to be solved that will bring back benefits here. Some of the telehealth, some of the stuff that Gordon was talking about, the benefits will be, you know, there. I think we'll throw to Ben, I guess, a little philosophical piece, but the other way I think of it is, you know, I'm very pessimistic about the future of this planet. Now, obviously space technology may help us with climate change and these or other things, but it might also be that, you know, in the next few hundred years, we need somewhere else to live, and it would be good to have a plan B. So I think that's really important as well. So it is hard because, yes, there's a lot of problems to be solved on Earth as well. But if this is a way to help solve those problems and looked in that light, and even InSpace's mission is about that, it's not just about space, it's what we can do for Australia, in general, from space. So I think that's the lens that I look at it from.
Go, Ben, and human risk management. Do we need a second planet?
Well, so I guess I have some sympathy with what Tracy just said, but I think there's also a danger of kind of giving up on Earth. You know, I mean, if Earth is done for, it'd be great to have somewhere else to go. But I think we don't want to get into this mindset where it's inevitable that we need somewhere else to go, because that can actually cause us to not address the problems that are afflicting Earth, and it can be kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think that's a bit of a danger there. I think there's another. Obviously, space technology, going into space, it's monumentally expensive. Now, how important is it that we be doing it now? I guess that's something we need to think about, because right now it's super, super expensive. But suppose we kind of got our act together on Earth a little bit better, became, you know, much wealthier and much more technologically advanced. Maybe in 200 years from now, it would be vastly cheaper and safer, and we won't have destroyed the planet in that time. So there was no urgency, perhaps, to jumping ship. So I don't know. I think there's the point you guys have made repeatedly, and it's a very, very important point, that perhaps the only way to develop some of these technologies is kind of by doing it. So if that's true, then there's, I think, a pretty strong argument for going into space. But maybe we would get to these technologies sort of anyway and more easily if we kind of just got our act together, took care of problems on Earth, became super rich and super smart, and then we could just, zip off into space, and then you could just, maybe we could even work out from here whether humans could be, fertile on Mars.
Can I cross to David there in a historical context to that as well? Do you think we should wait? History doesn't show it.
Yes, so why do we have to go to the Mars or space? It's always a very important question. And for the scientists, if we just mainly talk about scientific benefit or passion of the scientists, they want to explore new area or new world, but that's only one angle. So we have another angle, political perspective. All each nations, major, huge nations, they compete each other by the measure of the technology, space technology. Especially now, they major US and China and India and then other countries. They try to send a human to Mars. That actually for them is a political issue. So that's another perspective. Also, I want to talk about the space science is the most advanced technology on Earth by which we can actually protect the Earth and planet as well as environment. As Tracy already mentioned a couple of things, the space satellite, by that we can actually monitor the climate change stuff. Also, we can also monitor the pollutions, air pollution, water pollutions, and then other stuffs. Also, we also, it actually involving with the agriculture, how we can actually produce more crops by those technology. So it's not something the local technology can develop the space technology, but space technology can contribute to the local benefits. Let me just say once again also, there is another thing, some engineering stuffs. GPS you're using, everybody generalized. That used to be the space experts using that one, but it's a very commonized. Also broadcasting, weather broadcast technology, if we don't know how we predict the weather, that also coming from the space satellite technology. Of course, phone, we have it. Also clean water. Even the clean water the products, it actually coming from the space. They have a sort of a laundry water and the urine, actually space, they actually making a drinkable water. So those technology being applied for the human ordinary people to think.
Is that a yes, David? Is that a yes, we should be going?
Yeah, yeah. So so many things. Space science can be applied for make our Earth safe and a better environment. Yeah.
So I heard both sides of the arguments on that. Look, we are over time and we've got a networking session available to us. So I'd like to close it there, and my apologies for going over time. We just started a little bit later than what we thought as well. But can you please give a warm round of applause to our panel, Professor Tracy Smart, AO, Professor Gordon Cable, Associate Professor David Kim, and Dr. Ben Bramble. Thank you very much, appreciate that. We are going to have one close, and we'll just brief you on the Indo-Pacific Space and Earth Conference. We've got a couple of our speakers here from the Australian Space Agency as well for this particular session. But please give a warm round of applause for my co-director, David Mattray, and thank you, panel. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. First of all, congratulations to the panel and to Chris for moderating what, for me, was one of the most fascinating panels I've ever attended. Really interesting. And the engagement, obviously, we're still going. I think we could be here for another 3 hours at this rate. But if you've got some really good questions, ask them at the networking. You get a bit of one-on-one time with everybody. So as Chris mentioned, one of the things we'd like to talk about is Indo-Pacific Space and Earth Conference. As some of the people here in the panel have alluded to, there's a lot that comes out of space which gets applied to on-Earth technologies. And we're putting a conference together in Perth end of this year, in October, I should say, where we're bringing together people from around the world in space, in agriculture, in resources. So we've got 2 months to go. We have 70 speakers, actually we're at 80 at the moment, and 80 speakers, 12 countries. If you enjoyed this particular conversation, come over to Perth. I think you'll enjoy that particular conversation we're having over there as well. There's a lot of commercial outcomes which will come out of that too. It's just sort of a snapshot of what we're actually doing in terms of bringing space into agriculture, space into mining. It already happens, but there's obviously a lot more that can actually be done with that from that point of view as well. great speakers. Some of them are in this room, and so if you want to see them, come over as well. We've got people out of NASA, so we were talking about Artemis during that conversation. So we have Jim Freeze, one of our speakers, who's the mission director for Artemis. Somebody was talking about autonomy there. We've got a guy called David Korsmeyer out of NASA who is an expert in autonomy as well. So I could keep going, but I know we need to wrap up to get into the networking. But anyway, it's a terrific 2-day conference. There's opportunities for site visits as well. And you can see more on the website, which is spaceandearthconference.com, and happy to answer any questions. In the meantime, thank you very much. Thanks also to the team at ANU. You've been tremendous to work with. Again, thanks to the panel, amazing panel. Thanks to Chris, Laura as well. And we look forward to seeing you at the networking. Thanks very much. Thank you.